Good afternoon, everybody, for the Tech Talk Show this afternoon. And today on the Tech Talk Show, we're going to be talking about AKS, Azure Kubernetes Services. I've got Steve on the show with me this afternoon to walk us through today's topic. Good afternoon to you, Steve.
Hi, Kazim. Thanks for having me on the show here.
Hi. Oh, it's probably not afternoon where you are.
Nope,
Okay,
it's
okay.
morning right now, so.
Okay, then. All right, so you're very much welcome on the Tech Talk Show this afternoon. So I'm sure people listening will want to know a bit more about you. So I'm going to let you start by introducing yourself first, and then we can delve right in. So it's over to you now, Steve.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, again, thanks for having me on the show. I'm based in the U.S. I'm based out of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and let's see what else. I'm a Microsoft MVP. In Azure, I've been an MVP for 9 years. Primarily a Microsoft guy. That's where I've spent most of my career. I've been in IT for 20 years. Author of many technical books. The latest book was around Azure Kubernetes Service with my fellow authors Jonica and Ned Bevelance. They're both MVPs as well. And I blog at bucatech.com. So I try to keep that updated as possible. Like to blog about what I'm doing in the tech space, and I'm also a Pluralsight author.
Okay. Work now, Steve. So on today's topic, we're looking at AKS. So can you tell us, Steve, what is AKS and why do we need Azure Kubernetes Service?
Yeah, so containers is extremely popular, right? With Docker, and as companies adopt containers and they need more and more containers, they need orchestration for those containers, to manage those containers, the life cycle of those containers, and just to keep a handle on the explosion of containers. Well, when you start to use containers at mass scale, you need something like Kubernetes, right, to help you with the orchestration. And Kubernetes itself is complex, right? So AKS stands for Azure Kubernetes Service, and it's a managed service in Azure for Kubernetes. So it helps ease the deployment as well as management of Kubernetes itself to a certain point, and makes it a lot easier to onboard and adopt Kubernetes, right? So it basically takes care of, spinning up the Kubernetes cluster, monitoring some of the, RBAC and permissions. If you integrate it with like Azure Active Directory, takes care of some of the networking for you. It just makes it a lot easier, right? And offloads most of the management onto Microsoft so that you don't have to take care of that. You can focus on what's important and getting your workloads up and running on Kubernetes, and focus on, keeping those workloads up and running.
Okay. So just like you rightly mentioned earlier that, Kubernetes AKS can be, sometimes complex for some people. So what are those very important components now that makes up the AKS nodes, the clusters? What are those very important terminologies and components that you can walk us through that makes up the AKS?
Yeah, I'll do my best to summarize. We could probably spend, an hour talking about that alone. But essentially with Kubernetes, you have kind of the administrative side of things, and then you have the other side of things where you're actually running the workloads, right? And it's split between essentially like master nodes, and those are all the servers that run Kubernetes, like a Kubernetes cluster. And all the services that power that cluster. And then you have your worker nodes that are actually running the container workloads, right, on other servers. So with the master nodes, you have the control plane, and with the control plane, you have things like the API server, etcd, and that's your Kubernetes. That's a database essentially for your Kubernetes configuration. You have the APIs. Well, I already said the API server. And the API server is like what everything talks to. And when you're interacting with the Kubernetes cluster, that's what you're interacting with. You also have like scheduler, and there's some other items in there too, like controllers. And that's all on the control plane side of things, right? And then on the worker nodes, those are the servers that are actually running your containers, and you'll have like kubelet, you'll have kube proxy running on those servers. Now there's some other aspects to Kubernetes that are important too, and I think these are even more important to understand, and it's things like pods, right? A pod can be a container or containers running in a pod. So that's actually where your workloads are running. And then you'll have services that sit in front of that, and the services basically represent like a service. So if your pods are moving around, right, if they are running on, let's say worker node A, and those pods, worker node A is overloaded, so Kubernetes moves those pods to, let's say, worker node B, the service keeps track of that movement. So when the traffic is coming in for your service, it's going to hit that service first and direct that traffic to those pods, right? And then you have other things too, like you have namespaces, you have ingress controllers, and ingress controllers are, it's like ingress into your AKS cluster, right? And those can be, there's a bunch of ingress controllers out there that you could leverage. And then you have other things too, like namespaces and config maps and secrets. So there's a lot of moving parts to Kubernetes. And with AKS, chances are you're not going to touch the master nodes. You're not going to have to do as much on that control plane side of things. You will have to do some, but it makes life a little bit easier for you.
Yeah, thank you for that quick run through. For those listening right now, and if you're listening and you're new to AKS, not to worry. I'm pretty sure that towards the end, Steve would need to things with a demo. So I'm sure Steve will be kind enough to do that for us. But quickly before we get to the demo part now, let's touch on storage for a little bit. What's the difference between volume? I hear, volume when we talk AKS, and a storage class, storage volume claim, all of those, what's the difference between those two?
Yeah, the storage can be a little confusing, right? So you have a storage class, and that's basically a way for an administrator to define or describe like storage types in Kubernetes. And it's it's typically used for things like, maybe you have a certain backup policy, or maybe you need to define the reclaim policy, right? And you have something specific you need to do there. You can go ahead and define those things through a storage class. And then you have a volume, and that's essentially just, a volume of storage that's available to your pods if you need to store some sort of data, right? Now, one thing to keep in mind is a volume, it's live while your pod is alive, but when your pod's life cycle is over, that volume goes away. Right? And that's where persistent volumes come into play. So those stick around whether your pod is up and running or it's not. Right. And so sometimes if you need that storage to stay around, even, after a pod is taken down, you'll want to go with a persistent volume. And then a volume claim is just simply, basically a claim for persistent volume. Right. And so, you'll typically put that in with your pod. So when it spins up, it's going to make that claim for that volume that it needs.
Okay. So from your experience now, what choice of storage would you recommend when setting up AKS?
From a from an Azure perspective, you would use Azure Disk if you only need like storage for a single pod. And that can leverage like, SSD or regular storage on Azure. And then you would use Azure Files if you needed, multiple pods, which this is more common scenario, but if you needed multiple pods to access that storage or even across multiple nodes. Right. And so when you're using Azure Files, it's going to mount that storage as SMB. And, you can access it across multiple pods versus just one. So the more common scenario is to leverage Azure Files versus like Azure Disk.
Okay. So let's also quickly touch on security now. Since we have AKS made up of different components now, the cluster master, the node itself, or the nodes as case may be. So how do we ensure security of these different moving parts that makes up AKS?
Yeah, so so with AKS, you have, those master nodes, which has the control plane, and part of that is the API server, right? So you want to secure that, and you want to secure those master nodes and everything that's there. One of the very first things you can do, if this is okay in your scenario, is deploy AKS as a totally private cluster. Right, that way there's no public IP out there. The API server is not publicly accessible. It's private, right? Basically bound to within Azure networking. If that's not an option for you, and for some reason you need to have that available, you can basically lock that down to authorized IPs.
Okay.
Yep. You can secure it that way. The other thing is you'll want to deploy your AKS clusters with RBAC enabled. And so what that does is allows you to use like an organizational account to access your AKS cluster versus, just having to have accounts inside of AKS, right? Because it has its own RBAC. And so when you deploy it, AKS RBAC enabled, it's integrating it with Azure Active Directory. So that's another way of kind of locking it down and securing it.
You mentioned that it has its own RBAC, role-based access control, and you also mentioned Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. So I'm asking that when we integrate it with Azure Active Directory, do we get any better leverage with regards to security? How does it play out, integrating it with Azure Active Directory now?
So the main improvements that you get is you're able to leverage, your organizational accounts with AKS. And you're also able to leverage like, your groups in Azure AD with AKS, and you can create your roles and kind of manage it there. Versus having a different, place to manage your users and your roles. Right. So that's a huge benefit there.
Okay. All right.
Yep.
Okay. So before we leave security, how about data that we have in transit now? Data in transit, how do we ensure security of this kind of data?
Yeah, so there's multiple ways to do that. Is there like a specific scenario you have in mind for that one, or just generally speaking?
Just generically speaking, no. I don't want to assume that everybody is very technical with AKS. So let's just talk generically now. Yes.
Got it. Well, as far as data in transit, you want to basically encrypt that data, right, through SSL.
Yeah.
And so with AKS, what you want to do is if you're publishing things externally, you'll want to put it behind, of course, an Ingress controller, and then make sure that that traffic is secured, right? So you want to have that across SSL. If you're transferring data, directly to, like, let's say Azure storage, and you're going to leverage that data in AKS, that's going to be secured on that storage, and you can secure that traffic, that connection to Azure storage as well. Now, if you want to secure the traffic, any data that's flowing internally to AKS, you can put in something called service mesh, and that will enable like TLS, and so you're securing that internal traffic as well. So that's another way, but that gets more complex. And do that if you need to, but really evaluate if you really need that service mesh or not, right? Because remember, you can keep things internal and keep things private. And keep it on the Azure backbone.
All right. So because of time, Steve, I think we should touch quickly on demo. We've said it earlier that it can be difficult for someone who is new to AKS to understand all these different moving parts. So is there something you'd like to show us to help us connect the dots with AKS?
Yeah, sure. Let me go ahead and share my screen, and I'll just give you a quick demo. Again, AKS it's a monster, right? So it's a big topic, just like covering Azure would be a massive topic as well, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
You could probably spend a couple of hours going through.
Exactly. I'm sure you must be wondering, the topic, when the topic initially 30 minutes of AKS.
Yeah. I was like, 30 minutes of AKS is going to be fun and fast.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Can you
but
see
the
my
idea
screen?
is just to whet people's appetite a little bit about AKS, and they should be able to pick things from them. Yes. Your screen is very much visible now. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm logged into the Azure portal right now, and I have Cloud Shell open as well. I prepared a AKS cluster for us to just kind of work with. And so once you deploy AKS in Azure, the nice thing is that you have like this interface that you can work with, right? So I'm on the overview page. I think it's called the page here. And it just gives you general information about your cluster, right? So your version, your node pools, your networking, how you have that set up. And you can see that information down here under settings as well. And you can actually use this to make modifications to your AKS cluster, right? So I didn't set this one up to use multiple node pools, but if I did, this wouldn't be grayed out, and we could actually add another node pool to this AKS cluster. So if you needed more servers, you could do that. You also can come in here and modify the existing pool here. And so if you needed to make changes there or even delete that, you could. The other thing about AKS is you can add, what's called virtual nodes. And so you can actually leverage Azure PaaS as virtual nodes to run your pods on versus having to use full-blown like Linux servers. That's what nodes are, is they're just Linux servers. But we have a bunch of different things under here in AKS that makes life a lot easier for us. So we could, go to different versions. We could scale this up. We even could use Azure policies to help with the security of our AKS cluster, right? But And then you have some things down here, like under monitoring, where, and I didn't enable this on this cluster, I should have, but you can actually get monitoring like out of the box for your AKS cluster, and that'll monitor your AKS cluster and give you insights there, as well as the workloads that are actually running on AKS, so your pods. And Microsoft has done a great job there. Something that's fairly new with AKS is you can actually see the workloads or some of the resources that are running on your Kubernetes cluster, right?
Okay.
And this is really new. So if you want to see what's running on your Kubernetes cluster and interact with it, you can do it in here, right? So I could go in here and see the pods and work with them from here. Like I could actually click into the pods, and you have different services and ingresses and namespaces here, right? So you can kind of see the direction that Microsoft's going, and they're making it easier to work with your AKS, giving you a better interface here. Now, what I want to do here is I'm going to quickly deploy a pod here to my AKS clusters. So now remember, the pods are your containers, right? And so what I'm going to deploy is just a Super Mario video game, just a kind of a fun example here, without going into all the details of, you know, the pod file and all that stuff. So run commands to, you know, kube control or kubetal. I don't know how folks pronounce that, but I could run like kubetal commands to interact with the Kubernetes cluster, right? So I have that pod is running now, and if I were to refresh here, I'd see this pod. I got to scroll down, but there you can see it right, and I can click on, and I can actually see the details of this pod. And I can, you know, interact with here too. So I can see it's running here. I could actually access YAML right here.
Yes.
YAML is just the backend language for the pods. That's what Kubernetes uses. In fact, you use that for all of the API objects in Kubernetes. But I could actually come in here and modify this. My format is invalid. But I could modify this. I'm not going to do this. That wouldn't work. But I could modify this and actually save it right from the portal, and that would update my pod.
Okay.
Which is pretty cool. This is something new to AKS, right? Let's go back out here to the AKS cluster. And then I can do the same thing from Cloud Shell. And by the way, for anyone that's listening, if you're not using Cloud Shell, start using it today. It's amazing. It preloads like, you know, frameworks that you might use, languages, right? So like Terraform is preloaded in here, right? I could start running or writing Terraform right from here. It stands right in here too. But what I did is I got the services for this Kubernetes, or for the the Kubernetes cluster, and then here's my pod. Like how fast this spun up too, right? And Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah.
You can see there's pieces of that running, and it spun up all the networking for me. I mean, all I did was literally ran this, right, to apply and spin up that that container. I didn't have to wait for, you know, the OS to boot up or anything like that. Server to come online. I just ran that command, spun up that container, and it's running Java on essentially a scaled down Linux. Run that Mario game. So it's pretty amazing. And if you're new to Kubernetes, you can start to use the Microsoft interface to, you know, simplify working with it. right? So just like I ran syntax here to show the services, I can come into the interface and I can see that same service, right? So here it is right here. Here's the public IP, the external IP that I use to access the game. So you could get started here, but I'd highly recommend that you also learn the Kubeflow commands, because that's going to make life a lot easier for you and a lot faster when you're working with Kubernetes, right? The other thing I want to point is that, you know, like I alluded to earlier, there's services, and that's what this is. And you have different services. So what I spun up here was load balancer type. And what that did for me was it spun up in Azure load balancer and took care of you know, the load balance. It took care of everything for me. So it spun up that external IP and then connection to that internal IP. And so it's being load balanced. And so that's one of the other benefits of running AKS as well, is that it has that native integration with the Azure cloud plane, and it's able to work with resources there for you as well.
Yes. Thank you very much, Steve, for this very quick walkthrough of the demo to AKS. But let me ask you real quick before we wrap it up on today's episode. If a person is interested in learning about AKS, you know, a newbie now who is interested in picking up the skill, what would be your preferred resource, you know, for such a person?
Well, shameless plug here, pick up my AKS book. You can, you can go to my blog, another shameless plug, buchatech.com. That's BUCHATECH.
Okay. Do you mind, Steve? Do you want to help us put that in the chat box? So for those who...
Yeah, for sure, no problem. But yeah, so all joking aside, there's you know, we have an AKS book. I highly recommend you get started with that. It takes you through containers. It takes you through the basics of Kubernetes. So it gives you that foundation. Okay. And then it dives into AKS itself, all the way through like setting up, you know, a CI/CD pipeline.
Okay.
So you can grab that book. Also recommend checking out Pluralsight. They have some courses on Kubernetes and AKS. And then also recommend checking out cloudskills.io. They have some great resources, right? Mike Pfeiffer over there, and a lot of the folks that work with Cloud Skills. They actually have a great like crash course getting started with Kubernetes in a day. So that really can get you on Kubernetes. And then just the Microsoft documentation and the Microsoft learning path, right? Microsoft has done a ton of work, you know, building out some great content for AKS, and you'll gain a lot of Kubernetes, general Kubernetes knowledge from that documentation as well. And then if you haven't had enough documentation yet, go out to Kubernetes, just type that in your favorite search engine, and you'll get a lot of documentation there too. And that documentation is solid as well.
Yeah. So thank you very much once again, Steve, for coming on the show today. We're fast spent on time now, so we would have been able to take a few questions. Let's see if we can squeeze in one question perhaps for Steve before we let Steve. Yes. So I don't know, is there a question from anyone? So you can unmute your mic and speak, ask your question. Just one question for Steve.
Who is your favorite
Anybody
African,
want to ask
Steve?
any question?
Was there a question from Sam?
Yeah. Who is your favorite African? So, how did you get into AKS?
I gotta say you, Sam.
Thanks, Steve.
The question had to be AKS related, Sam.
I know. So, Steve, how did you get into AKS? I mean, a lot of people are always hearing about all of these new technologies. I know you didn't start with AKS, so loaded question, but what drove you to it and why did you feel it was worth investing in for you personally and your organization?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sam. And so my journey with AKS actually started with cloud and DevOps. I've been working in cloud for a while. I actually started with cloud in 2008 with like AWS. Started working with EC2 instances, right? And then I started working with other cloud vendors. I took a look at Microsoft, didn't really take it serious. It was classic back then. Jumped back into Azure when Microsoft moved over to ARM, and things got real. And during that entire time, I was doing like infrastructure as code and doing private cloud. Sam, as you know, we've been working in the system center space, so we were doing a lot of private cloud stuff. We were doing infrastructure as code. And that really started me down my DevOps journey, right? Kind of for the IT pro. And as I dove deeper and deeper into the world of DevOps, that pointed me towards containers. And one of the things that I always do to kind of keep a pulse on what companies are doing and, what the job market's doing is, I look at what companies are hiring for. And that gives me a pulse on, what are companies actually using? Because if a company is willing to hire folks with certain skills on certain technologies, that means they're actually using it or they're planning to adopt it in the very near future. So containers was technology that continued to pop up, in my personal evaluations. And of course, you continue to hear about it on blogs and like all over the place. And then I saw that Microsoft was adopting it, right? They decided to put Docker, make it friendly on Windows. They even decided to make Windows containers a thing. And diving into the containers journey, of course, leads to Kubernetes. And Kubernetes is just on fire, right? And as I was moving more and more into that journey, Kubernetes and especially AKS comes up more and more on projects, right? The other thing I want to say is that for the IT pro, Kubernetes is more of a, I think there's a misconception that Kubernetes is like a developer thing, and
yeah.
It is, but it's more of a, I would argue that it's more of an ops thing, because if you think about it, with developers, they want to write their code and just deploy it. They don't want to maintain servers or mess with networking or storage or any of that. Just give me somewhere to deploy my stuff and make it easy, right? And so as an IT pro, Kubernetes is actually something good to invest in, because you'll be the one like spinning up those AKS clusters. You'll be the one, making sure the networking is done right. You'll be the one making sure things are secure, making sure, that integration with Active Directory or Azure Active Directory is there, right? Those are ops infrastructure things, right? Developers don't want to worry about those things, right? So that went into my journey too, is like of adopting AKS. It was like, oh, this is not just for developers. There's actually more of a need from infrastructure people in this Kubernetes world and in this container world.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve, for that great response. So it's good to note that containers isn't just for developers now. You don't need necessarily to have developmental skills to learn about containers, to learn about AKS. So I'm sure we're going to be seeing more of Steve on the show. Steve, is that correct to say that you're going to be coming?
Yeah, I'm happy to come back so anytime and help. So love this. Shout out to everyone that's in Nigeria watching. You're gonna see me doing more and more stuff with just different tech professionals across Africa in general, right?
Okay.
So you're gonna see more of that. This is just the start of that journey for me.
Okay, so how about us listening to you say bye bye in in Nigerian language? How about we close up with that?
I don't know how to say goodbye in Nigerian, but I do know how to say hi in Igbo.
In Igbo, okay.
That's it. So I'm gonna have to have some calls with you. You'll have to teach me. Right? You have to teach me some of your tribal language and teach me some pidgin English and stuff. So
okay, no problems, too. So we're fast spent on time now. So I think I will just draw the curtain on today's episode of the Tech Talk Show. So thank you all for listening, and we can continue the conversation on social media. So it's Tech Talk Wednesday with Kazim on social media on Facebook. You can have a replay of the video also on YouTube as well. Tech Talk Wednesday with Kazim on YouTube. So I will do this again next week. Thank you very much. And a very big thank you to Steve for coming and sharing your time and your knowledge. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Kazim.
Okay, bye-bye.